Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, everyone else. How do you do? Welcome to Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclasts, the podcast. And I'm your host, Mike Lucht. Still a little bit under the weather, so I'm not kicking off any big series yet. But we are doing a profile on a man to which everyone in the field of high strangeness owes a debt of gratitude, or we would not be here at all. Nay, they say. Also, stay tuned, listeners, to the very end, because I want to get you guys to do a little vote on which. I've got a couple series lined up. One's a little more, well, just stay to the end. I want to get you guys to vote on which topic will be next, basically, kind of gauge your reaction. But, anywho's, let's take a dive into the life of a man, the plan for the damned. Damned data that's awaiting, that rhymes close enough, a man such as himself, Charles Fort Low! In the early 1920s, a stout man with a walrus mustache and thick glasses could be found daily in the reading room of the British Museum, surrounded by stacks of scientific journals, newspapers, and astronomical reports. He was reading them not for their conclusions, but for their accidents, the anomalies they dismissed, the data they excluded, and the phenomena that didn't fill or fit accepted theories. His name was Charles Fort, and he was researching work that would change the way we think about the boundaries of reality. Fort had spent much of his adult life as a journalist, short story writer, and collector of oddities. He had no formal scientific training, no academic position, and no institutional support. What he did have was a mind that couldn't accept the dogmatic explanations he was given, a temperament that took pleasure in questioning authority, and a devoted wife, Anna, who stood by his eccentric research despite living in near constant poverty. Thanks for taking one for the team, Anna. He had moved from New York to London in 1921, not for his health, as some biographies will claim, but to immerse himself in the vast archives of the British Museum to follow up on his newly published landmark work, The Book of the Damned, 1919. There he would spend years compiling tens of thousands of notes on the damned facts science had ignored, laying the groundwork for his future books and cementing his legacy as the father of anomalist research. He is the original anomalist. Coming this fall to Fox. The massive collection he compiled was the damned data, the facts excluded from the scientific canon, the observations that didn't fit the theories, and the anomalies that were swept under the rug of respectability. Fort had read through decades of scientific journals, and he'd found within them a pattern. When scientists encountered something they couldn't explain, they didn't revise their theories. They excluded the data. They called it error, fraud, or hallucination. They made it just disappear. Fort's mission was to make it reappear. A teleportation of sorts, if you will. It's foreshadowing. He would collect the damn data, organize it, and present it without the interpretive frameworks that destroyed it. He would let the anomalies speak for themselves. And if they spoke of a universe far stranger than science admitted, if they suggested that we're not alone, that we're not free, or that we're in some sense property, then so be it. Fort's method was exhaustive. He read not for the conclusions of scientific papers, but for the footnotes, the asides, the cases mentioned only to be dismissed. He found patterns that the original researchers had missed because they weren't looking for them. He found that strange things fell from the sky, not just meteors, but organic things, things that didn't belong, things that suggested a universe of constant exchange, of teleportation, of objects moving between places without traversing the space between. He documented falls of fish, frogs, snakes, and stones. He found cases of thunderstones, stones that fell during thunderstorms, oddly enough, often shaped like axes or tools, often warm when they landed, sometimes reported to have been seen falling from the sky before the storm even began. Geologists call them erratics, quote-unquote erratics, and invented glacial transport to explain them. But Fort noted the pattern. They often fell in connection with atmospheric disturbances. They were often associated with lightning, and they were often found in places where glaciers had never touched. He found cases of red rain, rain that fell as blood, that stained clothing and buildings and contained organic matter. Science called it dust from the Sahara, or pollen, or algae, but Fort collected cases where the rain fell in specific patterns, where it fell only on certain areas, where it contained things that shouldn't have been in the atmosphere. In 1890, in Calabria, Italy, a red rain fell that was found to contain animal matter. In 1869, in Los Angeles, a rain fell that was described as quote-unquote meaty, containing particles that looked like flesh. But Fort wasn't interested in these falls as meteorological curiosities. He was interested in what they suggested about the nature of space, time, and matter. If things could appear from nowhere, if objects could move from one place to another without traversing the intervening space, then the universe wasn't the mechanical system that science described. It was something more like a mind, something capable of intention, something that could move things around at will. It was in The Book of the Damned, published in 1919, that Fort articulated the ideas that would become his most disturbing and most enduring contributions to anomalist thought. Quote, "I think we're property," unquote. The statement appears almost casually, buried in a chapter about strange astronomical observations, but it represents the culmination of Fort's thinking about the patterns he had found. What Fort meant was this: the evidence suggests that humanity is not the autonomous species it believes itself to be. The falls from the sky, the teleportations, the coincidences too patterned to be random, the astronomical signals that seem to be intelligent, all suggest that something was managing human affairs, something that had an interest in human activity, something that treated humanity the way humans treated livestock or experimental animals. Fort was careful to say that he didn't know what that something was. It might be extraterrestrial. It might be interdimensional. It might be a property of the universe itself, a kind of cosmic ecology in which humanity was just one species among many, subject to the same management that humans applied to cattle or wildlife. But the evidence suggested management. Nonetheless, things appeared when they were needed. Disasters were preceded by warnings, strange lights, sounds, falls of matter that seemed designed to be noticed but not understood. The universe seemed to be playing a game with human consciousness, giving just enough evidence of the strange to keep the question alive, and yet never enough to provide a straight answer. Fort developed this idea further in his subsequent books. In New Lands, 1923, he examined the evidence for what he called the Super Sargasso Sea, a region of space where lost things accumulated, from which they occasionally fell back to Earth. He wasn't being entirely metaphorical. He had found cases of objects appearing in places they couldn't have reached by normal means. Stones falling from clear skies, animals appearing in closed rooms, artifacts found in geological strata where they didn't belong. These weren't just curiosities. They were evidence of a universe in which the conservation of matter didn't apply, in which things could be moved instantaneously from one place to another, in which space itself wasn't the void that science described, but something more like a medium, something capable of holding and transporting objects. By the way, totally unrelated, but Super Sargasso is also the name of a comic book character I invented who's like a psychedelic Aquaman. I got a ton of them. Comic book publishers, if you're listening, hit me up. Central to Fort's philosophy was the idea of what he called the cosmic joker, an intelligence or force that seemed to take pleasure in confusion, that arranged coincidences too perfect to be random, that seemed to be playing a game with human understanding. This wasn't a benevolent deity nor a malevolent demon. It was something more like a trickster, something that enjoyed the discomfort of uncertainty, that undermined human knowledge just when it seemed most secure. Take it down a peg. Fort found evidence of this joker in the patterns of coincidences he collected. People who dreamed of disasters just before they occurred, objects that appeared in multiple places simultaneously, numbers that recurred with frequencies which defied chance. The joker seemed to be arranging reality like a stage magician, creating effects that could be interpreted as supernatural or as perfectly natural depending on the observer's framework. The joker was particularly evident in what Fort called the acceptance, quote-unquote the acceptance, the way that scientific theories were accepted not because they were true, but because they were useful, because they allowed work to proceed, or because they were supported by institutional power. Status quo. The Joker seemed to be constantly undermining this acceptance, introducing anomalies that didn't fit the theories, forcing scientists to either ignore the data or construct increasingly elaborate explanations that strain credulity. Fort saw this most clearly in astronomy. He collected cases where astronomers had observed things that shouldn't exist, objects moving between planets, lights on the moon, signals from Mars that seemed to be intelligent, etc. In every case, the observations were dismissed, explained away, or forgotten. The astronomers had seen something, but they couldn't accept what they had seen because it didn't fit the framework. So they unsaw it and made it disappear. One of Fort's most disturbing collections concerns what he refers to as the intermediate state. Cases of people and animals who seem to exist between life and death, who couldn't be classified as either alive or dead, and who violated the boundaries that biology insisted upon. Fort was also fascinated by reports of, quote, incorruptibility, unquote, cases of human bodies that seem to resist the natural process of decay. While myths surrounding such phenomena often relied on exaggerated accounts or artificial preservation, real-world examples were often cited in discussions of anatomical anomalies. One famous historical case involved Julia Pastrana, a 19th century indigenous Mexican performer born with hypertrichosis, who was billed during her lifetime as the Bearded Lady, or Bear Woman. Following her death from childbirth complications in Moscow in 1860, her body was not buried in ordinary soil, nor did it spontaneously resist decay. Instead, a professor at Moscow University artificially embalmed and taxidermized, I think that's the way you put that, taxidermized her remains alongside her newborn son so they could continue to be exhibited as curiosities across Europe for decades. Thanks, humanity. Though Pastrana's preservation was the result of deliberate human intervention rather than a biological mystery, Fort nevertheless gathered accounts of unexplained bodily preservation, suspended animation, and cases where physical remains appeared to defy conventional medical explanations. He found cases of, quote, suspended animation, unquote. People who were declared dead, who showed no signs of life, who were buried or prepared for burial, only to revive hours or days later. These weren't just cases of premature burial. Some of the subjects had been examined by doctors, shown no heartbeat or respiration, been dead by every medical standard, and yet they revived. Some reported experiences during their death, visions, travels, encounters with beings or places that suggested their consciousness had continued even when their bodies had stopped. Fort also found cases of animals in intermediate states, insects that appeared in sealed containers, worms that emerged from living human bodies, creatures that seemed to generate spontaneously from inorganic matter. Though Fort was careful to say he didn't necessarily believe in spontaneous generation, he was collecting the reports, noting the patterns, suggesting that the boundary between living and non-living was not as clear as biology claimed. These intermediate cases were important to Fort because they suggested that the universe wasn't the mechanical system that science made it to be. If things could exist between states, if the transitions between life and death were not absolute, then the materialist framework was incomplete. There were forces or conditions that science couldn't account for, states of being that didn't fit the categories. Fort's concept of teleportation, quote-unquote teleportation, coined the term, was broader than science fiction versions of people beaming from place to place. He meant something more fundamental, the ability of matter to move from one location to another without traversing the intervening space. And he found evidence that this was not just possible, but common. He collected cases of quote-unquote apports, objects that appeared in seance rooms, in locked cabinets, in spaces where they couldn't have been placed by normal means. He found cases of things disappearing, a stone that was seen to fall from the sky, picked up by a witness, then vanish from their hand. A ship that was seen by multiple witnesses, then disappeared without sinking or wreck. People who vanished from locked rooms, from closed carriages, from the sight of companions who turned away for only a moment. These weren't just magic tricks or hallucinations. Fort found cases with multiple witnesses, with physical evidence, with documentation in newspapers and scientific journals. The witnesses weren't spiritualists or mystics. They were ordinary people, often skeptical, often trying to find normal explanations for what they had seen, but the phenomena defied normal explanation. Fort suggested that the universe might be, quote, teleportative, unquote, by nature. That space wasn't the empty void that physics described, but something more like a medium, something capable of holding and moving matter in ways that didn't respect the usual rules of distance and time. If this were true, then many of the anomalies he collected became comprehensible. The falls from the sky were things teleporting into the atmosphere. The disappearances were things teleporting out. The thunderstones, quote-unquote thunderstones, were objects moved by atmospheric energy, teleported from somewhere else. This wasn't just speculation. Fort found cases where the teleportation seemed to be associated with specific conditions: electrical storms, geological disturbances, states of consciousness in the witness. There were patterns, there were rules, even if science hadn't discovered them yet. Fort was particularly interested in astronomical anomalies. Not the regular movements of planets that astronomers studied, but the things that appeared in their observations that shouldn't have been there. He found dozens of cases of lights on the moon, objects moving between planets, signals from Mars that seemed to be intelligent, and so on. In 1894, astronomers at the Lick Observatory, reported seeing a bright light on the moon that moved and changed shape. In 1913, a British astronomer named F.B. Watson observed what he called, quote, a strange object, unquote, crossing the face of the moon. These weren't just meteors. They were objects that moved with apparent intelligence, that changed direction, and that seemed to be under control. Fort was most interested in the evidence for what he called the Martian engineers, quote-unquote. He collected cases of signals from Mars, lights that appeared in regular patterns, geometric formations that suggested construction, changes in the planet's appearance that seemed to be artificial. In 1892, an astronomer named William Henry Pickering reported seeing what he called, quote, luminous points, unquote, on Mars that moved in ways that suggested intelligent control. In 1909, another astronomer reported seeing a canal, quote-unquote, that hadn't been there before, then watched it disappear. The astronomical establishment dismissed these observations. They were optical illusions, they said. They were defects in the telescopes. They were the products of overactive imaginations. But Fort noticed the pattern. The observations were made by competent astronomers using good equipment. They were corroborated by their observers. They were reported in scientific journals before being forgotten or explained away. Fort suggested that Mars might be inhabited by beings who were engineering their planet, who were capable of sending signals to Earth, and who might have visited or be visiting. This wasn't just speculation. It was based on the data, an observation that had been made and then suppressed because they didn't fit the accepted narrative of an empty solar system. In his final book, Wild Talents, 1932, Fort turned his attention to human capabilities that exceeded the normal, what we would now call psychic phenomena, but what Fort saw as something more fundamental. He collected cases of poltergeists, fire raising, telekinesis, clairvoyance, and other wild talents that seemed to violate the laws of physics. He found cases of people who could set fires with their minds, pyrokinetics, who could ignite objects at a distance, who could cause spontaneous combustion in materials that shouldn't burn. He found cases of poltergeist activity that couldn't be explained by fraud or hallucination. Objects moving in locked rooms, heavy furniture levitating, stones falling inside houses with no source. He found cases of people who seemed to know things they couldn't have known, or who predicted deaths and disasters with accuracy that defied chance. But Fort wasn't interested in these phenomena as evidence of spiritualism or supernatural power. He was interested in them as evidence of human potential that had been suppressed or forgotten. If people could move objects with their minds, see distant events, predict the future, etc., then human consciousness was not the limited thing that science described. It was capable of interacting with reality in ways that violated the materialist framework. Fort suggested that these wild talents might be related to the cosmic management he had posited in earlier books. If humanity was property, then perhaps these talents were the remnants of capabilities that had been suppressed, that were being managed or controlled by whatever forces owned humanity. The talents appeared sporadically, unpredictably, and often in people who were marginalized or even institutionalized. They were dismissed as madness or fraud, but Fort saw them as evidence of something real, something important, something that science was ignoring because it couldn't be controlled or explained. Fort's books are filled with cases so strange that they defy easy categorization. These are the cases that don't fit neatly into standard Fortean categories. suggesting a universe far stranger than conventional science, or even Fort's own working hypothesis could easily account for. In 1883, near Scargill, England, a massive body of ice weighing an estimated several hundred pounds fell out of the clear blue sky, crashing into a field. Local scientists examined the block, noting that while mainstream meteorology claimed large ice falls were simply giant hail, the sheer size and conditions of the drop defied atmospheric theories. Fort collected dozens of these icefall cases, asking where such vast, isolated frozen masses could originate if not from some unknown region of upper space. In 1908, in the town of Cherbourg, France, residents witnessed a shower of small living frogs fall during a torrential storm. While orthodox meteorologists explained away such events as the work of whirlwinds scooping up ponds, Fort delighted in pointing out the flaws. The storms almost always dropped only one species of animal, neatly sorted, without mud, weed, or water, and often in locations where no whirlwinds had been recorded. Science? Something to say? No. In another bizarre case documented by Fort, a mysterious fall of gelatinous organic substance, historically dubbed star jelly or nostoc, see my black goo phenomena episodes for more on this, fell over large areas of Bath, England. When examined, the translucent substance baffled observers. It was warm upon landing, evaporated rapidly without leaving a clear chemical trace, and defied identification by local botanists and chemists. Fort collected cases of, quote, out-of-place artifacts, unquote, also known as ooparts. Objects found in geological strata where they shouldn't exist. In 1852, a block of coal was broken open in a mine in Scotland and found to contain a gold thread embedded in it. The coal was millions of years old. The thread was clearly artificial. In 1891, in Morrisonville, Illinois, a woman found a gold chain inside of a lump of coal. The chain was 8 inches long and appeared to be of modern manufacture, yet the coal was from the Carboniferous era, 260 million years old. These cases weren't just curiosities. They suggested that the timeline of human history was wrong, that there had been previous civilizations or visitors or something that didn't quite fit the accepted narrative of human development. Fort didn't claim to know what these objects were, he just collected them, noted their existence, and suggested that science should be interested in them rather than dismissing them. Among the most persistent sensational claims in 19th and early 20th century American newspapers were reports of giant human skeletons uncovered in ancient burial mounds. Local papers frequently ran exaggerated accounts describing skeletons measuring anywhere from 8 to over 12 feet tall, complete with massive skulls and jawbones that could purportedly fit over a living man's head. Two widely circulated reports from the era came out of the Midwest. In 1879, newspapers claimed a burial mound in Brewersville, Indiana, yielded a 9-foot, 8-inch skeleton that was examined by local doctors before mysteriously disappearing or being destroyed in a flood. Similarly, an 1895 report out of Ashtabula County, Ohio, claimed workers had unearthed giant bones measuring between 8 and 9 feet tall. In reality, modern historians and archaeologists have shown that these period reports were typical products of yellow journalism, sensationalized local lore, or misidentification of prehistoric megafauna, such as mastodon or Ice Age bison remains, misinterpreted by lay people. While Fort did compile newspaper clippings of giant skeleton reports alongside his collections of strange phenomena, he treated them with his usual trademark irony and detachment. Rather than championing the existence of 20-foot humans, Fort was intrigued by the cultural pattern itself, how local press, small-town doctors, and early antiquarians rushed to publicize extraordinary finds, only for the physical evidence to evaporate under professional scrutiny. For Fort, the giant phenomena served as another case study in how information circulated. Whether the reports were genuine anomalies suppressed by mainstream anthropology or simply exaggerated tall tales consumed by a gullible public, they fit his broader critique of how human societies handle, report, and ultimately exclude data that doesn't fit the accepted scientific narrative of the day. Fort collected cases of spontaneous phenomena that suggested forces or energies that science didn't recognize. These weren't just fires or explosions. They were events that seemed to violate the conservation of energy, that appeared to generate force or heat from out of nowhere. He investigated cases of so-called spontaneous human combustion. instances where individuals appeared to burn intensely without a clear external ignition source, often reducing the body to ash while leaving nearby furniture surprisingly unscathed. However, many of these classic tales rely on exaggerated or inaccurate details. For instance, while stories frequently cite a 1906 case in St. Petersburg, Florida, involving a man named John Benton, local records from that era show no trace of such an incident, making it a widely repeated urban legend rather than a documented mystery. When legitimate cases of extreme localized burning do occur, modern forensics attributes them not to spontaneous ignition, but to the wick effect. In these scenarios, an external source, like a dropped cigarette or stray ember, ignites an incapacitated victim's clothing. The rendered body fat then acts like candle wax, fueling a slow, smoldering, extremely localized fire that can destroy bone over several hours without igniting the surrounding room. Now, as a true crime listener, I know that it takes a very, very high heat to burn bone to ash. So, even that in itself, in these specific instances, is an anomaly in an anomaly. He found cases of exploding stones, rocks that burst apart with violent force, sometimes injuring witnesses, sometimes damaging buildings. In 1850, in the town of Padua, Italy, a stone in a church courtyard exploded with sufficient force to break windows. In 1895, in Clintonville, Wisconsin, a stone exploded in a farmer's field, leaving a crater. These weren't meteorites, they were ordinary rocks that suddenly released energy that shouldn't have been there. I believe it was over a decade ago, at least now, there was a stone in Japan that was legendary for containing the body and soul of the eight-tailed kitsune or fox woman that was known as the killing stone. And it just spontaneously busted in half in front of witnesses, I believe, and was, of course, duly interpreted as a horrible omen. Still waiting to see what's developing from that. Check into that. It's been a while since I looked into that story. Fort suggested that these phenomena might be related to the quote-unquote wild talents he documented in humans. That there might be energies in the environment that could be triggered by conditions that science didn't understand. That the universe might be more volatile and more capable of sudden transformation than physics allowed. One of Fort's most subtle but important contributions was his documentation of coincidences that seemed too patterned to be random. These weren't just the occasional alignments of events. These were systematic patterns that suggested some kind of organizing intelligence or principle. He found cases of people who dreamed of disasters just before they occurred, with details that matched the actual events too closely to be chance. In 1900, a man in England dreamed of a train crash at a specific location with specific details of the wreckage. 3 days later, a crash occurred at that location with those same details. The dream had been documented before the crash occurred as well. He found cases of simulacra, patterns that appeared in nature that seemed to be messages or symbols, rocks that looked like human faces, cloud formations that spelled words, tree growth that formed letters. These weren't just pareidolia, Fort argued. They were too specific, too frequent, too patterned. They suggested that the universe was capable of generating meaning, that it wasn't just random, but in some cases communicative. Fort developed a theory of what he called, quote, the hyphenated state, unquote, the idea that things could exist in states between the defined categories of existence. A rock could be in a hyphenated state between organic and inorganic. A person could be in a hyphenated state between life and death. The universe was full of these intermediate conditions, these states that didn't fit the either-or categories of science. Fort's methodology wasn't just collection. It was what he called, quote, the philosophy of acceptance, unquote, the willingness to accept data without forcing it into pre-existing frameworks. Science, he argued, was based on the philosophy of exclusion, the rejection of any data that didn't fit the theory. This was useful for building coherent systems, but it was disastrous for understanding a universe that might not be coherent, that might be fundamentally anomalous. The philosophy of acceptance meant taking the damned data seriously. It meant not dismissing witnesses as frauds or lunatics just because their reports were strange. It meant acknowledging that there were things in the universe that science couldn't explain, and that this wasn't a failure of the things, of the objects or events, but a limitation of science. Fort was not anti-science. He was anti-dogma. He believed in observation, documentation, and the careful collection of evidence. But he believed that science had become akin to a new religion, with its own orthodoxies, heresies, mechanisms for suppressing dissent, and so on. The scientific establishment had become as close-minded as the religious establishments it had replaced, the scientific inquisition. His philosophy was not nihilistic. He didn't say that nothing could be known. He said that what we knew was limited, that the universe was far stranger than our knowledge, and that we should be humble about our certainties. Humble about our certainties. The damn data wasn't proof of anything specific. It was proof that the universe wasn't fully understood, that there were mysteries that deserved attention, and that the search for knowledge was not finished. Probably never will be. Fort's life was not easy. He was poor for most of his career, supported by a meager inheritance and occasional journalism work. He was sick, suffering from chronic respiratory problems that made travel difficult and sometimes impossible. He was isolated, working alone in libraries and small apartments without institutional support or academic community. What's that like, Charlie? But he had one crucial ally, Theodore Dreiser, the novelist and editor who had been Fort's friend since their days as young journalists in New York. Dreiser believed in Fort's work when no one else did. He helped him find publishers, wrote introductions to his books, defended him against critics who dismissed him as a crank. Without Dreiser, Fort might have never been published. With Dreiser's support, he became a cult figure, read by small but devoted audiences that included writers, artists, and the occasional open-minded scientist. Fort's writing style was also unique. He wrote in a kind of free associative prose, moving from case to case, building patterns through accumulation rather than argument. He was funny, ironic, self-deprecating, a bit of a schlub, but a lovable schlub nonetheless. He mocked his own theories, even as he proposed them. He mocked the scientists he criticized, but he also mocked himself, his own obsessions, and his own need to find patterns in the chaos. He wrote 4 books in his lifetime: The Book of the Damned, 1919, New Lands, 1923, Lo, 1931, and Wild Talents, 1932. Each was a massive collection of cases, organized not by category, but by Fort's own associative logic, building towards the conclusions he was careful never to state too definitively. By the early 1930s, Fort's health was failing. He'd moved back to New York from London, living in the Bronx with Anna, his wife, continuing to write and collect data, but increasingly aware that his time was limited. He was working on a 5th book, which would have extended his investigations into new areas, but he didn't live to complete it. Charles Fort died on May 3, 1932, at the age of 67. He was buried in the family plot in Albany, New York. His books went out of print for a time, remembered only by a small group of devoted readers who called themselves Forteans, who continued his work of collecting the damned data. In the decades after his death, Fort's influence grew tremendously. His books were reprinted. The Fortean Society, founded by his friend Tiffany Thayer, kept his work alive. Writers like Eric Frank Russell and Damon Knight drew inspiration from his ideas. The magazine, Fortean Times, founded in 1973, continues to document the damned data, following Fort's methodology into the 21st century, though I will say they tend to lean a little more heavily on the skeptic side, but that's all right. It's their show. Fort's influence on anomalist research cannot be overstated. He created the template for the serious study of the unexplained, the exhaustive collection of cases, the resistance to premature theorizing, the skepticism toward both official science and uncritical belief. Every serious UFO researcher, every paranormal investigator, and every anomalous scientist works in Fort's shadow. His concept of "we're property" has been taken up by later researchers and developed in various directions. Some have interpreted it literally, suggesting that humanity is owned by extraterrestrial or interdimensional beings. Others have seen it metaphorically as a critique of social control, the ways that human freedom is limited by forces both seen and unseen. Fort himself was never entirely clear about what he meant, and he would have been the first to say that he didn't know. He was offering a hypothesis, not a conclusion. His methodology, the collection of excluded data, the philosophy of acceptance, the resistance to dogma, remains relevant. In an age of increasing scientific specialization and institutional control of knowledge, Fort's insistence on the rights of the anomaly, the value of the excluded, the importance of the unexplained is more necessary than ever. Fort's work was unfinished by design. He never claimed to have solved the mysteries he documented. He never reached any final conclusions. He was a collector, an organizer, a curator, a suggester of patterns, not a system builder. He left the work for others to continue. And others have continued it. The damn data keeps accumulating. Goddamn data. Every year brings new cases or falls from the sky, teleportations, astronomical anomalies, wild talents, intermediate states, what have you. The universe remains as strange as Fort found it, and as resistant to explanation, as well as full of the unexplained. Fort's final contribution was to change the way we think about the unknown. Before Fort, the unknown was something to be feared or dismissed, something that would eventually be explained by science, something that didn't belong in serious conversation. After Fort, the unknown became something valuable in and of itself, something that challenged our certainties, something that reminded us of the limits of human knowledge. To quote the most excellent MC, MF Doom, who I believe is paraphrasing Socrates, the more you know you don't know shit. Quote unquote. Speaking of quote unquote, I think we're property. Quote unquote. The statement remains as disturbing today as when Fort wrote it. We don't know if it's true, we don't know what it means, but we can't dismiss it either. Because the data Fort collected, the falls, the teleportations, the coincidences, the wild talents, suggest that something is happening that we don't understand. Something that implies management, control, or ownership. We are not the autonomous beings we believe ourselves to be. We are a part of something larger, something stranger, something that Fort could only glimpse and suggest. The investigations continue. The damned data accumulates. And the universe, as ever, remains weird. That's going to do it for this episode, folks. Another short one while I'm getting my voice back. Whoever stuck through this whole thing, I appreciate the hell out of you guys, and I have a question that hopefully my voice will be back to tip-top in the next few days. I wanted to see if you guys would like to do a vote on which topic comes next. Now, I'm not going to give too much away on either one, but I'm going to try and frame them in equally mysterious and vague yet tantalizing aspects that may help judge your decision. Now, first choice, it's a two-parter called Horrors of the Microcosm. It has to do with everything creepy and crawly, right down to the the most micro of the microcosmic scale, and yet somehow circling back around to the macrocosm. Or, there's another route we could go. The Game of Saturn. Now, I've pointed out here and there that I've been looking into various Saturnian aspects and traditions throughout history, trying to find bits and pieces of the way this tradition may have survived into the modern era. Predatory elite magicians, things like this. What I've found is not quite the ending that I think a lot of people will find fulfilling. I say that because a lot of people want there to be, it seems that they want there to be this evil cult behind the operation at the top, this sadistic Illuminati, working things from the shadows, manipulating humanity en masse. Now, I did research that goes into that route, but then I took a more subtle approach, a more alchemical approach, let's say, and I think I found answers that, while they won't be as fulfilling to the people who want there to be an evil cult, it instead shows just how insidious this sort of tradition, this wave, this symbolic energy happens to be, and how deeply embedded it is within humanity. We do these things to ourselves, folks. That's all I can really say. But I will say that for the Saturnian thing, I went down both routes. I went down the insidious cult route, and I went down the more subtle alchemical route. So there you have it. Horrors of the Microcosm. If you don't like bugs or bodily parasites, or the way that bodily parasites might be connected to demonic possession, etc., things of this nature. There's also some very disturbing material in the Horrors of the Microcosm. Even if you don't really have a thing against bugs like I do, I don't know. I had a psychedelic experience once that was tantamount to alien abduction. I won't call it being abducted by aliens, but I was placed into a hive-like mind state. That's the best way I could describe it. Probably the worst bad psychedelic experience I've ever had in my entire life. And it fucked me up for a good while, but I managed to shake it off, as you eventually do with things of that nature, and see it for, an experience. It happened. So, there's that. But, yeah, if that's enough information, hopefully, to guide your route, which way you would like to go for the next series that we get into. Horrors of the Microcosm is a straight 2-part series, whereas the Saturn stuff is, it's one definitive episode with a few sort of attached other episodes that build onto this other framework. So, yeah. Either way, both of them will become episodes, but I wanted to see which you guys might want to hear first. So, just let me know in the comments. Hit me up. Drop a vote. And, yeah. That's going to do it for this episode, folks. I appreciate the hell out of you guys for sticking with me while I'm getting over the crud. There's a lot of stuff going on in my life all at once, and rolling with the punches. But I love doing this show, and I want to make sure that I'm still doing the thing I love. And I'm glad you guys are here on the ride with me. Fucking awesome. I appreciate the hell out of you guys. You're the best. I love you. Love yourselves. Love each other. And take care of each other, because we are all we got. From the abyss of deep weirdness to the peaks of high strangeness, the outer limits of the Twilight Zone. This has been Kooks, Cranks, and Iconoclast, the podcast. I'm your host, Mike Luck, and I will see you guys on the next one. Peace.
What happened to you?
Well, let's just say I've finally shed my feminine side. Like a snake sheds its fur,